Welcome to Conversations on the Coast. Today we are joined by a Pulitzer Prize-winning author whose name is Tracy Kidder. His new book is called Good Prose, The Art of Nonfiction, but this book is so tough to do that he didn't write it alone.
That's true.
His co-author is his editor, and his editor's name is Richard Todd. The publisher is Random House, and boy, are we glad to have you back.
Oh, it's nice to be back, Jim.
You know, I often disagree with what the publishers send along because, you know, I try to be a curmudgeon in my old age.
Right.
But this is one time when I absolutely agree 100% with every word in the lead sentence of the flap copy. Good Prose, it says here, is an inspiring book about writing, about the creation of good prose and the record of a warm and productive literary friendship. That is exactly what this book does. And it says it right there.
Right.
And folks, if you're not interested in that, then listen to another station. But boy, this is a very touching book, and I think extremely well timed. We have people running around talking about, I don't need an editor. I can self-publish. I can do it. Now, I had a fellow here on this program several months ago who was a person promoting that approach to publishing and, you know, with lots of snide remarks about the, you know, foibles of the big houses. Mm-hmm. And at one point I said to him, okay, so now you've written the book. What happens? Oh, then I go out and hire an editor. I said, so now you got the book, you know, bound and gagged and ready to go. And what do you do now about getting the word out? I hire a publicist. And then we went on and on in that vein. So that whole approach, it seems to me, has some holes. And one of the holes is that there's no way that publishing in that fashion can bring writing, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, anywhere as close to what it ultimately is supposed to be. That is one of the fine arts.
I think I generally agree, although, you know, there are always exceptions. But I, you know, one of the smartest people I ever met in my 40-some years of writing and dealing with publishers and magazines and so on was a guy named William Whitworth, who was the head editor of the Atlantic Monthly for a while. Yeah, really good guy, very smart. And he once said to me, every writer needs another set of eyes. And I don't know that I can speak for every writer, but I certainly did. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I'm not sure that, I mean, if I had managed to write any books at all without the help of Richard Todd, I'm not sure they would have been any good. And, you know, for me, it was absolutely an essential thing to have this relationship with this guy who, you know. So
yeah, well, it isn't just good; it's as good.
Yeah,
you know.
Yeah.
I mean,
as good. Yeah.
Person who writes a book, let's say, okay, they've got talent, they've got writing talent.
Yeah.
But is it as good as it can be?
Well, I think that's
that's really
that's better
really
said,
the business right there.
Yeah, and I don't know. It's wonderful to have another set of eyes. I mean, the other thing that he would say, Dick Todd, we call each other by our last names the way our drill instructors.
Yeah, you mentioned. Well, no, when you got together first at the Atlantic, that's the way it was done. Yeah. Now, in addition to that, you left early for lunch.
That's right. Yeah. Oh, they did. I didn't. But yeah. Well,
the two of you got together on this book somehow.
Yeah. Well, he wanted to do it.
Yeah.
I didn't. I wouldn't have had the chutzpah to write about writing myself all by myself. And I guess I was a little reluctant at first, but it was a lot of fun. And part of it was that I got, you know, there was some moments of revenge. I got to edit him.
What a day! What a day!
Mostly it was a matter of trying to get him to work, you know, to write. He's one of these guys who doesn't write really fast.
Oh,
and I do write fast. I write as fast as I can.
Okay.
To prevent remorse for having written badly, and then I rewrite.
Between the two of you, he reluctantly apparently You've put together stories and advice from a lifetime of writing and editing. Once again, reading what the publisher has sent, and it's right on the jacket. And in doing that, you explore 3 nonfiction forms: narrative, essay, and memoir.
Right.
And it's really then becomes quite comprehensive, doesn't it? I mean, what's left?
Well, history, diet books.
Well,
I'm kidding. But history certainly is something we didn't even begin to tackle.
Well, actually, I suppose what you did was look at those kinds of nonfiction that you've been involved in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The 3 kinds that we've worked on together.
Okay.
I mean, I do make mention in there of, well, no, it's a memoir, actually. I was thinking of U.S. grants. You know, the one great piece of presidential memoir is U.S. grants.
Yes.
It's the only one, but it's really good. It's really good. You know, I was going to say that the business of needing an editor, I mean, what Todd would tell you is that it's wonderful to be involved as an editor from the very beginning, from the conception of the book, particularly if we're talking about this kind of factual narrative that I've done for the last 40 years. It allows you to, and I mean, he tries not to intrude, but or write for me, but it's without him, I don't know, it wouldn't have been as good.
Well, you've learned that meeting early has become essential. Now, Good Prose tells us a lot about your career, including early on, when someone said of you, let's face it, this fellow can't write.
That was Bob Manning, who was
More about this when we come back.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at JimFosterCoc or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Good Prose, The Art of Nonfiction is the title we're dealing with this week. The author, one of the authors, Tracy Kidder, is with us. His co-author and editor, Richard Todd, is back working someplace, probably on some first draft that's hardly readable. But that's what happens when you're the editor and not the ever-popular star author. Oh, dear. Greenblatt, Stephen Greenblatt, author of The Swerve, How the World Became Modern, who won a National Book Award for that book, says of Good Prose, The Art of Nonfiction, it takes us into the back room, behind the shop, where strong, effective, even beautiful sentences are crafted. Tracy Kidder and his longtime editor, Richard Todd, offer lots of useful advice, and still more, they offer insight into the painstaking collaboration, thoughtfulness, and hard work that create the masterful illusion of effortless clarity. I never knew you for effortless clarity, but I mean, if Greenblatt says so, I'll accept it.
You've underestimated me, Jim.
Now, the guy who said those nasty things about you, that you're a fellow who couldn't write, is whom?
Bob Manning, Robert Manning, who was the head editor of The Atlantic when I first was working there. He was a friend of mine, really. He died just recently. I think he was in his 90s. But, I think he said that sincerely at the time. You
were a young whippersnapper.
I was a young whippersnapper. I was kind of desperate. But, the thing that amuses me about that story is that I never knew that for almost 40 years. And Todd finally told me that Manning had said that. He kept it from me, I think, until he thought that I was stable enough to take it.
I think this fellow Todd is a man of wisdom.
I think so too, and I think that tells you something. One of the most important qualities of an editor is restraint. I think an editor has to restrain himself from doing the writing for the author, which is often very tempting. I've done some editing myself.
Yeah,
and the other thing is to realize that. To figure out who this writer is, how insecure is this writer, or where do this writer's insecurities lie? Because every writer I know is pretty insecure. It often shows itself in arrogance, but Todd understands very well that all pieces of writing, even great pieces of writing, can be ridiculed, and it's so much easier to do that with some, sort of tender shoots of an early piece of work, and he knows just how to tell you the truth without confusing. He can tell you that a piece of writing isn't working without making you feel like you're a bad writer. I think that's really crucial.
And he, in turn, says that one of your great strengths is that you're not afraid of writing badly.
Yeah, well, I'm afraid of writing badly in public. Yeah, right. I'm not afraid of writing badly in front of him. I'm afraid of writing badly in public.
Yeah, but that's the key to the whole thing. One of the keys to the relationship between writer and editor. That you can bear your bad side,
exactly,
your bad writing side,
exactly,
and he or she won't hit you over the head.
And rewriting is such a gift. How many other departments of life can you think of where you get to take back what you said and get to say it better before anyone has to say it except for your poor editor?
You and Todd believe in several things, a lot of, but two of them that stand out, as I recall. Number one is the power of story and character. And we're talking about nonfiction here. Mm-hmm. And that's a little surprising.
Well, really, though, Jim, factual stories have been told beautifully for, centuries. If you like the Peloponnesian Wars by Thucydides, for instance.
Right. We gather around the fire, and here's the story. And some of them are true. Some of them are. Never mind.
Some of them aren't, but never mind. Yeah. I don't think that the arts of storytelling, the techniques of storytelling ever belonged exclusively to fiction.
Uh-huh.
What I do think is the really important difference is not in the manner of the storytelling. It's the fact that I at least believe that if you call something nonfiction, you ought not to be making stuff up.
Okay. But on the other hand, both you and Todd maintain that all the techniques of storytelling are at the disposal of the nonfiction writer, except for making things up.
Exactly.
Okay. There's a statement that you make in a couple of three places at least. As you write, you say, you begin to understand your story. Don't you understand the story at the very beginning?
Not me. I never do. Really, I don't. What I typically have done over these years is found somebody who was really interested and gotten interested in his life and in the subjects that preoccupy that person and hung around with that person or that group of people. And, I come back finally to my study with piles and piles of notes. And I have some idea of what of the story that what the story is, what the essence of what I've seen is, but I'm not ever sure until I start to try to write. And it's a way of thinking. Writing is. It's a manner of thinking for me.
And as you begin to write,
right,
that's when the thing really starts to take shape. And at least in your case, and maybe in all good writers' case, what's taking shape is not the final shape.
Not for me. I can't speak for other writers. Everybody does this differently. But for me, it's so much of this is trial and error and, and auditioning stuff to try to figure out what is literogenic and what isn't, what will work on the page. What event, what scene can I, that's, true, can I write that will stand for 30 others that are like it?
Yeah. What of that pile that's now sitting on my desk makes sense to use?
I'm not smart enough to figure that out ahead of time most of the time, so I have to try it out. And because I wanted to write more than one book in my lifetime, I had to write fast and then rewrite and rewrite. I write about 10 drafts of every book.
One of the most used forms of nonfiction writing these days is the memoir, of which you say, the good and honest memoir is neither revenge nor self-justification. You got to talk to a lot of people.
Well, we noticed we said the good and honest memoir. There are an awful lot of memoirs. And there are a lot of bad memoirs, but there are a lot of bad novels and a lot of bad pieces of nonfiction and essays and so on. It's an important and interesting form.
In good prose, there are several times when Mr. Kidder describes the dynamic between author and editor. We'll share the best of these when we return.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
We are talking today to Pulitzer Prize winner Tracy Kidder about his latest book, which is co-authored by his editor, Mr. Richard Todd. And the title of the book is Good Prose, the subtitle, The Art of Nonfiction, the reading line, which is also important here, stories and advice from a lifetime, 40 years, of writing and editing. And our good friends at Random House had the sense to publish this book because it's a good one. And John Krakauer, author of Into the Wild, a pretty good country writer, as we like to say here, says, Good Prose offers consummate guidance from one of our finest writers and his longtime editor, explaining that the techniques of fiction never belonged exclusively to fiction. That's what we were talking about in the last segment. Kidder and Todd make a persuasive case that, quote, no techniques of storytelling are prohibited to the nonfiction writer, except making it up. Only the attempt to pass off invention as facts. See how much better he says that? Writers of all stripes, from fledgling journalists to essayists of the highest rank, stand to benefit from this engrossing manual. Now, when you talk about the essay, you say some strange things. It's the most freedom-giving form of nonfiction. Explain that.
Well, I'm not sure I can exactly, except that it gives you the most. It's asking for your opinion in a sense.
Well, but the other thing you say, which I think really is the key, the essay is that form where a writer can make a great deal out of nothing.
Exactly.
And Lord knows there are a lot of writers out there with nothing about which they're trying to make a great deal.
Right.
And whoopee for the essay. And it's any small idea and off you go.
And you can turn it into something wonderful.
Requires less research than you're into?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, that it's such a protean form. It could be heavily researched. Do you remember Lewis Thomas, that beautiful book, The Lives of a Cell?
Yes. Yes.
Those were essays, and of course, that was a lifetime of research he was drawing on there.
Yes.
So, I don't know, but it doesn't necessarily require a lot of research. Yeah.
Now, I want you to help me, poor interviewer that I am, to keep my promise and share with the audience what I think is your best take on how things worked between you and your editor.
Oh, gladly do that. I'll read this passage. I like to remember the first book we worked on together, The Soul of a New Machine, not just the book itself, but also the time of working on it, and especially the final phase. It took place over perhaps a week, or maybe two, in Todd's office at the Atlantic. I loved that shabby, genteel place, especially after hours. Sometimes when I was there at night working on an article, I would take a break and wander the halls. The place was utterly still then and felt vast in space and time, the night watchman's marijuana smoke rising from the basement. I could wander into an office and gaze at framed letters from writers who had published in the Atlantic, studying the signatures of Twain and Emerson, Thoreau and Wharton, and dreaming. That computers had not yet replaced typewriters was, in retrospect, a blessing. When the manuscript of Soul had improved enough to be considered a reasonable facsimile of a book, Todd and I spread its parts on the carpet in his office, as we had sometimes done for articles. Tall windows flanked the fireplace, shedding plenty of light on the piles of typewritten pages. Spreading the pages across the floor in itself lent the illusion of distance and control as we walked among the piles like a pair of Gullivers. In the afternoons, Heinekens helped us through the difficulties. Where should this thing really begin? Aren't the proportions off? Why do we give 13 pages to that and only 2 to this? Now and then Todd picked a couple of pages off the floor for closer scrutiny and said of some passage I had long admired, knowing it was grand and indispensable, you could do without this. That was when I began to learn a skill which, for me, needs constant relearning, how to fall out of love with my own words, and much harder, of course, how to let go of some perfectly lovable words that nonetheless are at odds with the whole. By the time we were done, Todd's office smelled a little like the inside of an old taxicab, but ashes still lay in his fireplace. It was late winter, I think, and the smell of creosote mitigated the odor of my incessant cigarettes. He squared up the edges of the tattered final manuscript and placed it on his desk. "Well, Kidder, this is a pretty good book," he said. "I don't think I've read another quite like it." High praise, the highest I have ever heard from him or want to hear. In a week or two, it would begin to wear off, and I would start to wonder what he thought I should do next. For me, nothing much has changed since then.
What you say there and how you say it brings those two things together. This man is my editor. This man is my friend.
Yeah.
It really, it's an amazing piece. I'm glad you shared it. One of the things that Todd says about you in another place is that he says that you have an interest quite unusual for a writer, an interest in virtue. It's an immeasurably hard subject, much harder than vice. A bright thread of goodness runs through his subsequent books. You want to buy higher praise than that, fella?
That's pretty good. I'll take it. I did, Jim, I got very lucky at one point. There was a point at which I was trying to snow the woman who finally became my wife, and I said, as a very young writer, I wanted to write about someone who was intensely good. And, finally, I wrote about a lot of people I really liked and a lot of people I admired over the years, but then I finally ran into that person, Paul Farmer, in a book called Mountains Beyond Mountains.
Yes. Good Prose, The Art of Nonfiction. That's the book of the moment. The author, Tracy Kidder, has been with us on Conversations on the Coast. I'm Jim Foster.
Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.